Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Erika Way with Beyond Wellness and Beyond Oxygen, and I have the great pleasure today to introduce my mentor and colleague, Dr. Jason Saunders, who is and has been a huge inspiration to me and a great teacher. And my hope and want is to be able to continue to bring information about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, not only to my patients, but to my community and to people at large. And here's why. And this is what Dr. Saunders is going to talk to us about today. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a revolutionary strategy for health, wellness, and longevity. And part of the problem can be some people don't understand it. But today, we're going to stop that dead in its tracks. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Saunders, who is finishing his PhD in Miami right now and has come up with some groundbreaking studies to help us further understand how we can impact our patients' health, specifically with hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Dr. Saunders.
Thank you so much for having me. I love sharing this information. I particularly love, conversations that you and I have had, over the last handful of months together, and having the opportunity to share some of this information, like you said, to your community, to your patient base, but also to the community at large, because as you alluded to, there are still so many myths and misconceptions about hyperbaric. It still seems either, um, sort of the old wives' tales of hyperbaric persist, throughout this industry. And, quite honestly, I've seen it with my own eyes. I know you've seen it with your own eyes. And so, knowing that there's something so much more than I think what's been discovered thus far with hyperbaric, that's really what I think pushed me to want to do the research, just to say, I know that it's happening. People who are using hyperbaric chambers in their clinics know that these things are happening, but we need to quantify it. We really need to understand which pressures are having which effects. We need to understand which protocols are the most effective. And so, that's really why I went back to school, at 41 for a PhD, and wanted to do the research to give back to the hyperbaric community, so we have a better understanding of how to apply this therapy, to get the results that you and I and the other folks practicing this, know that we can get.
Awesome. That sounds great. So, um, I love that your passion carried you back to school in your 40s. It carried me back to school in my 30s, um, and so grateful we could share all of this today. So, tell me, what were some of the biggest surprises or observations that you made with this study, and maybe explain it a little bit so people can understand what that study actually entailed.
Sure. So without getting, too deep into the woods, because there's a lot embedded in there, I would say in teaching hyperbarics for the last handful of years, you can imagine I get a lot of questions, and there are certain questions that just come up over and over again. And one of them is, especially in the industry, do soft chambers work? That's just like a very fundamental question that, again, if you've been using soft chambers for any length of time, the answer is yes. Clinically, you've seen it. However, there has been less research in that soft chamber environment than there has been at higher pressures, in hard chambers. And so wanting to just get to the point to say, do they or don't they? And if they do, what are they doing? And, is it similar or is it different than what higher pressure is doing? And so, this particular study, I would say, isn't even the end of that conversation. In a lot of ways, I feel it's the beginning. But it was an attempt to really start to understand and gain perspective on, future work that could also be done. And so in this study, we had 30 participants. So we had 10 go through a lower, a mild pressure setting, the same setting that would be on a soft chamber. We had 10 people go through a higher pressure exposure, and then we had 10 control. And in those 10 control, obviously it's a control group, so they didn't get treated at all, right? That was sort of the premise behind that.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the initial phase of the study, those 10 that were the control then got split in half. And so half of them went into the mild group and half of them went into the high pressure group. That's called a crossover. And with a crossover study, it allows you to start almost sort of showing it's reproducible, right? These 10
Right.
people had a certain result, and if the next 5 people in each group or the crossover group has a similar result, you can say, okay, there's obviously a reproducible effect that we're having here. And so that was really the basis for that. And then we looked at cytokines, which that term's become more popular in the last few years with cytokine storms and the like. But cytokines are basically, for the most part, immune molecules, but we'll say that they're inflammatory chemicals inside of our body. And so
Okay.
the goal was, can we have an effect on inflammation? We did computerized cognitive assessment. So can we have an effect on memory or, attention or focus, those kinds of things?
Mm-hmm.
And then we did a whole series of epigenetic testing, which was looking at, um, the cellular expression of health. And so, could we have an effect at a genetic level on the DNA and the epigenome on, the health cycle or the life cycle of a cell? And if we can, exactly, which areas of cellular health are we actually impacting? And so that was sort of the framework. And my hypothesis, like what I was going into this study with, was I believe that soft chambers and hard chambers would have a very similar effect. I thought that higher pressure would have a larger effect or a faster effect, and that
Mm-hmm.
the soft chamber would have a similar, but it would take longer or need more sessions to get sort of that same amplitude of effect, physiologically. And what we found, maybe I won't give away all the details in this moment, but I would say this is what we found was in certain areas, that's exactly what it was. Mild pressure had a very similar effect as higher pressure, and it just did require a little bit more to get there.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also areas where lower pressure had certain effects that higher pressure just didn't have. Likewise, there are some areas where higher pressure had certain effects that lower pressure didn't have. And so there was a mix of results as far as that goes. But now we have a much better understanding of, answering the question, do soft chambers work? Exponentially, the answer is just yes. I mean, yes, they do. And they work in all of those categories. They worked on inflammation, they worked on cognitive function, and they worked on the epigenetic level. And now we have a better understanding of like, well, what are the nuances of these pressures and, what were those effects?
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And I am newer than you into this industry, and that was perplexing even to me as I started. So for you to be able to do that level or that dive into the research, no pun intended,
Yeah,
is amazing. Now I'm wondering, I get not wanting to share all the details in this moment, but what would you like to share, or what were some of the bigger pieces that were like ahas for you on either side?
sure. So I think there were a few. So number one, and I have a whole list. So we checked, I think, 71 different cytokines in that
Mhm.
panel. And the each group had an effect on about 20. In one group, it was in the mild pressure was about 22 of them, and in the higher pressure, it was 24 of them. Okay.
Okay.
And within those, let's say low 20s on each of those groups, they had about 10 in common. And so they had about 10 also very unique. And so depending on, again, the effect that we're trying to have, um, which, it becomes which pressures are going to have, the most effect on this person or that person. And so there'll be some interesting, more data that comes from this and, maybe some testing that we could do to figure it out. But I would say, especially on the mild pressure side, number one, does hyperbaric reduce inflammation in a mild setting? The answer is definitively yes. It has a very strong effect on a handful of different interleukins, which are cytokine molecules that are inflammatory based. So reducing that inflammatory effect. But what I would say is there's a short-term effect of this and a longer-term effect of this. So the short-term effect could be almost relatively quickly lowering the inflammation inside somebody's body.
Mhm.
Okay. And both mild and higher pressure did that. But as I look and evaluate some of the epigenetic information, and I would call that the longer term effect. In other words, it's one thing to say, here's an amount of inflammation and we lowered it.
Right.
It's something very different to say, I literally turned on or turned off the gene that's associated with the inflammatory response. Okay. So that's a much, it would take a little longer to get that response, but that's also a much longer lasting response because you've actually changed, the instructions or the expression of that cell's genetic um, detail. And so what it appears, at least at this time, is that mild pressures actually had a much higher effect on the epigenetic level from an inflammatory standpoint. So,
Mhm.
so both would reduce the inflammation. Maybe the higher pressure reduced some inflammation a little bit faster, but the
Mhm.
mild pressure had a much more long-lasting effect by, addressing the epigenetics around the inflammatory response. So that's one area that I think is really exciting and obviously requires more digging, but on the surface, it looks like that's one distinction to make. Another distinction to make would be um, whether it was mild or high pressure of of the cognitive testing that we did, attention, motor skills, focus, memory, and information processing. Couldn't think
Mhm.
of that last one. Of all of those, in the mild group and in the high pressure group, all of them improved. So it was incredible just to see that uh, on either group, the needle moved significantly in all of those areas.
Okay.
Now, once we crunched the data and had to get, statistical significance, so
Mhm.
all of them trended in that direction. But when we had to get statistical significance, memory was really the one that shined through. So mild pressure and high pressure both had a statistically significant effect on memory, specifically above all those others. But all of them trended in the positive direction. So from a cognitive function, again, I kind of feel I knew this just based on responses that people were reporting to us in the office, but to see it on paper is just, it helps to just clarify that even in my own mind, let alone, for other practitioners. The other thing to mention here is everybody in my study was non-diagnosed, asymptomatic. In other words, like a healthy human.
Right.
And the reason I did that was I don't want this to be viewed as a treatment for disease.
Mhm.
I want this to be viewed as cellular optimization, regardless of where your health is, regardless of where you are in the health continuum, if you
Right.
will, from very, very sick to, thinking you're as healthy as can be. Can we optimize further? And I believe that something like oxygen, which is primarily, one of the major benefits of hyperbarics, this increased level of oxygen should lead to increased cellular performance, regardless of what may or may not be going wrong inside of a person. And so rather than looking at this as like, well, can hyperbaric help people with dementia? There's actually a decent amount of research that says, yes, they can. Therefore, we could say hyperbaric helps with memory. But could we just take the average American, put them through a series of treatments, and improve their memory, thereby stating that like this is something that could or should or at least be considered to be an ongoing therapy as we all age and are moving in a direction of, maybe lowered health over time? Is this something that can help us maintain our health in the face of aging? And it appears that the answer to that is yes.
That is so amazing because again, I think with the last several years, people have really stepped into a heightened awareness around health, right? Because there are times when it can be very fragile. And so, if you're a proactive person to say, what can I do to prevent
Right.
an illness or prevent what I see my parents going through. I see that all the time. I can't tell you how many calls I get from adult children wanting to help their parents. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes, as you might have experienced it, the calls come in maybe at a point where um, the odds of it being super helpful are lower, right? Just based on
Right.
age and the extent of the issue going on with the parent. But what I do say to the people that I speak to is, and to my patients is, you know, what you can do is knowing even just observationally what's going on with your genetics and how a certain lifestyle or a certain situation might impact you. I've got great news, and most people like good news, Jason. And
Yeah.
so to think about it the way you're talking about it, it's like longevity. And we know that telomeres can lengthen with hyperbaric oxygen. And I don't know what your details said about hard or soft, or if that was kind of something that was both, just a little bit of different in the timing. But one thing we've known for a long time, and it was an article written in February 2007, Time Magazine, right? So if we've got a magazine coming out that's really more mainstream. We know it's people have known about it for a long time, but now we're really coming out with it. And that was that inflammation is the root of all chronic disease. And they called the title on that magazine was Inflammation, the Silent Killer. So if we know that hyperbaric, both mild and hard, can impact that right away. And then if we know that a strategy that someone might have for longevity can really potentially stop, from what you've seen, that genetic expression. And of course, I'm sure there's other things that we can do, but you weren't doing other things. You weren't adding nutrients or anything else. This was 100% just
Right.
hyperbaric. So that is so exciting. I can't even stand it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good point. First of all, I like good news. Um, and a lot of the things that I've done in practice, and I'm sure you're very similar this way. Most of us are. Like when you love what you do and you're passionate about your craft, there's usually a personal, behind the scenes component to that, right? And so I have, I'm sure you do too, like a handful of stories that have sort of, nudged me in one direction or another, practice wise or school education or through this research. But a lot of what I do is because, my grandmother, my mom's mom died of ALS at a pretty young age, and dementia is something that runs pretty strong in my family. And I'm like, these are some pretty scary neurological issues, neurodegenerative issues that like if there's a way to avoid, I'm going to take those steps. And so, we've seen a handful of papers that have come out in the last, decade or so about, somewhere, depending on the paper you want to read, somewhere between 75 and 90% of all the chronic illness
Mhm.
is, first of all, lifestyle based,
Right.
and inflammation is at that root. And so if we know that, that means A, what are some strategies for reducing inflammation? And B, what is this lifestyle that's shortening our life or pushing us towards chronic illness? And it puts a little bit more control back into our hands. It's not like, based on your genetics, you are just on this inevitable road of health decline where, we could try to help you feel a little bit better, with less pain and, less aggravation throughout your inevitable health decline, but there's really nothing you can do about it. All of a sudden, into like, hey, in 5 years, you'll be 5 years older, so will I. But in 5 years, you could be healthier than you were today. In
Right.
10 years, you could be healthier than you were today. And here are some strategies that you can actually implement to have that happen. One of the things I said it quickly at the conference where we were, a couple of
Yeah.
weeks ago, but it's a really profound finding based on what you just said. We've seen a study on telomeres, to your point, which
Hmm.
I think was very impactful for our understanding of, some of the behind the scenes of what hyperbaric is actually doing for people. I was interested to look at the epigenetics because I think that epigenetics takes the concept of telomeres to a whole new level in terms of, again, cellular expression of health. Telomeres are associated, so longer telomeres are associated with younger, less inflamed lives,
Hmm.
and shorter telomeres are associated with shorter, more inflamed lives, more, uh, higher levels of cellular damage. But there's no definitive causation. It's more of a correlation.
Okay.
Whereas epigenetics, there's a lot more of causation going on here. And so that's why I chose that for the research that I did. But one of the findings that we had, we were asked to share our findings with another lab for an Ivy League school that's basically looking at new algorithms to understand longevity and the
Hmm.
effect that different therapies that people are doing will have on longevity. Things like maybe you've heard exercise is good for your health.
I,
Um,
no, huh.
clean diets are good for your health, right? And so
Mhm.
they basically looked at 55 different either therapies or strategies that people are using for longevity. In
Mhm.
some cases, individually, like a Mediterranean diet versus a keto diet, versus a paleo diet, and then exercise on its own. But they also looked at like cardio versus strength training or combined, right?
Mhm.
They even looked at combining, cardio, exercise, strength training with certain diets to really make these, more robust strategies. And
Right.
across all 50, if you remove diseases like things that we know shorten longevity, like HIV or
Right.
diabetes, like certain chronic illnesses that definitively reduce longevity in humans. If you remove the diseases and you're left with these, they call them healthy humans, but they're really just asymptomatic and non-diagnosed, because I believe
Mhm.
that there's probably still a lot of room to improve their health.
For sure.
But if you remove disease and you left with these asymptomatic humans, the number one strategy for improving longevity was high pressure hyperbarics, and the number two strategy was mild pressure hyperbarics. Literally, hyperbaric oxygen is the most effective tool according to these algorithms that they use. And I didn't crunch this data, so this is like independent assessment of the data that we collected.
Mhm.
These were the number one and number two strategies for improving longevity. So I have no doubt that the place of hyperbarics in the future of, just the health planning of for you and your family and for me and my family and for all of the patients that we treat or have the ability to impact, using this as one of the most important tools for helping people understand the direction that they need to go health wise. Um, I mean, the data is now overwhelmingly obvious. So, it's just really exciting, I think, to be able to know that we can impact people using this tool the way that we can.
That is it's so exciting, and I just feeling the energy in the room at the International Hyperbaric Association conference was, I mean, it was palpable. You could just feel just people's energy around knowing, like you had said earlier, I see it, but now we know it. The testing is coming and proving it. It just solidifies so much of what we already know. That is was music to my ears for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So amazing. The other thing that, talking about how health can be scary, right? I mean, we don't have to look too far back in history to feel fear around health. And um, and so what I love about what you do in addition to hyperbaric and what I do is when we combine functional medicine, we can actually help our patients see like their own independent study. We get to see their markers improve, whether now, not that those have necessarily been done, but if people are having high inflammation markers, I mean, there's other ways for people to see their own improvements other than just how they feel with some of these other tests. So it's exciting to see what we have moving forward, but that we have additional tools is,
Yeah.
the idea is how can we empower people with their health so that they can transform their lives and their children's lives and manifest. I mean, let's be honest. Why did you come here? What did you come here to do? Who did you come here to help? And we can do that better when we feel amazing.
Right. Yeah. And, we've, to your point, we've been doing different tests on different patients for different reasons throughout all these years. And there's a combined effect of, where even though the hyperbaric research that I did, like whatever diet they were on, they had to stay on. Whatever supplements they were taking, they had to keep taking. They could have never had hyperbaric before. So there were like certain details. Can you control every variable on planet Earth? Of course not. But what metrics did we put in to try to keep that as controlled as possible throughout the process?
Hmm.
To make sure that there was no like synergistic impact. However, you and I both know, and I teach this all the time, the magic is in the synergy. And so for the research, you can't really combine things, but in practice, we can. The global effect that we can have as we start to incorporate the dietary changes
Mhm.
with, certain either deficiencies, replenishing certain
Mhm.
deficiencies a patient may have, or understanding a toxicity load that they have, that their body is, currently challenged with, that it's not detoxifying properly. So like helping them detox, creating sufficiency that where there's deficiency, and
Mhm.
then applying other modalities like hyperbaric and others to really stimulate growth, repair, and regeneration. I mean, the possibilities are quite almost unlimited.
Almost
So
unlimited.
yeah, I love that concept, and I think that's also important to keep in mind. These aren't like therapies to be done in a vacuum. These are actually best done, in combination to really help drive people's health in a direction. To your point earlier, you said something like, unfortunately, a lot of the people that come are pretty far down that, chronic illness road by the time they see us.
Mhm.
Now, we could still be impactful, and I'm sure you've seen it, I've seen it. Like, the earlier we get to somebody, the more impactful any of our strategies are. And that's just true of every strategy in health in general. I think that starting earlier is always going to be more impactful and more important than delaying it and starting later.
For
That
sure.
being said, even when we have somebody who's very advanced in their disease, we can still see great improvements. But connecting with their caregivers, their loved ones, their family, their adult children, their
Mhm.
adults, children's children,
Right.
really understand that these were all things that, yeah, you might have we have loved, not you and me, in medicine. There's
Yes.
been this like, you know, um, blaming our genetics on everything. Every disease, every problem is like it's all genetic. Well, you're just genetic. It's that, but to
Genetic and
understand,
stress, right?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. But to understand that like you can impact your stress, right? And you can impact your genetics, and you can
Right.
impact your genetics through therapies that manipulate the epigenome,
Mhm.
right?
Well,
Exercise manipulates the epigenome, right?
right.
Diet manipulates the epigenome. Hyperbaric manipulate, not in a
No.
negative way, in a positive way, to turn certain markers on and off that allow humans to just express higher levels of health over time.
Right.
And
Because
that's the direction I think medicine needs to go, period.
right,
Probably.
because the body wants to be healthy, and there's a ton of mechanisms that really it already does for us that tries to keep us healthy, right? Cleans up all the old cells. I mean, it really wants that. And when you give the body the tools and give the brain of the person who you're working with the information and knowledge, I mean, it's just, when we talk about the cellular level and toxicity and all the things we're exposed to that we don't even see, right? No one sees the oxygen, right? No one sees the toxins often. But if we can clean that up, which can, toxins can interfere at every single step of the citric acid cycle, which then leads us into ATP cellular energy. So if we can detoxify, give the cells more power to detoxify, and then build the mitochondria and grow with that vital nutrient of oxygen,
Mhm.
I mean, I get excited. I mean, I get excited when I wake up in the morning about that.
Me too.
Yeah. I want to say, I first of all, I appreciate your time so
Sure.
much, but I want to say that you and your colleague, Dr. Dettori, have put together this amazing new textbook. It's a little blurry here that goes into the depths of the science around hyperbaric and the history, and it's just amazing. And this also came out at the conference, and you've got a wonderful book to help physicians who might be interested in building a blueprint for wellness strategies. And I just have to say how grateful I am to you for the contribution you've made, not only to me, but to everyone out there, because without your work and your passion, um, there there wouldn't be hyperbarics the way that it is today. So I just want you to know that I appreciate you so much.
Thank you very much. Especially whether it's the research or those books, I know that there are a lot of people. First of all, there's a lot of people suffering, like from a, from our communities. Your community is very different than my community, let's say, and anyone else that might see this video, or anyone in practice. We all have our own unique practice. We all have our own unique communities that are coming to and working with our practices. And I think that there's this tendency for practitioners to start in practice for a certain reason, and then there's challenges that we didn't know about, insurance and billing, scheduling, like just the business of
Right.
being in practice, which I think it ends up slowing down that practitioner's purpose and enjoyment. And that was never what it was supposed to be about. I think you can practice. I think you could implement different strategies that you may not like mine or you may love mine. It doesn't matter, but there are strategies that each practitioner loves, and there
Mhm.
are ways to do it in a way that gets great results. And there's ways to do it that feel very fair as like a value exchange between the clinics and the patients receiving those therapies. And there's a lot of detail there that you and I were never taught in school, and only in 20 years of practice can I say, you know, I've gotten a handle on some of those, and that's really what that practice management book is about.
Mhm.
But that hyperbaric book, I mean, you've taken our courses and stuff. Like that hyperbaric book is um, a strong correlation to our courses to really get as much of this newer information. Hyperbaric's been around for 350 years. Most of the research that's been done on hyperbaric has been on a very select few diagnoses that we, tend to treat in traditional medicine with hyperbaric. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of information that we know about hyperbaric. We've had research, but it hasn't been collected in a way to be taught so that somebody could really digest it in a sequential way. And that's really what that hyperbaric book is about. And so, for providers that are looking to understand it at a much deeper level, that's really why we put that together. But you know, none of this is mine. Dr. Dottori, who co-authored that hyperbaric book with me. I mean, we say this all the time. That research isn't my research.
Right.
That book isn't my information. Like
Right.
this is yours. It's everybody's. These are existing, science is just science, and that information in that book has just been collected and sort of, curated and then put together in a digestible way. But it's not like it's mine or Dr. Dottori's. It's everyone's information. We're just trying to share it because we see this major gap between medicine going in one direction, traditionally,
Mhm.
the health of Americans are going a different direction.
Mhm.
And there's this huge misunderstanding. And so the closer we can get on a same page, where at least we're um, consistently working together with patients to move their health in the right direction, that's kind of all I really want. That's all I really care about. So,
Right. I
but
mean,
I appreciate your thought there. Thank you.
well, I appreciate all the work that you've done. It's made my job easier, and it's made the clinic staff job easier. So just a ton of gratitude. And thank you so much for your time today. And I will get this out and share it with the masses.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
We'll talk soon.
we'll talk soon.